Okay, autonomic nervous system. So everything that we're going to talk about in here is going to be autonomic, which is involuntary. Fantastic. So, this is also referenced as the involuntary nervous system. No surprise there. But the general viscera, or visceral nervous system. And why would that make sense? Visceral is your organs, and that's all involuntary. Yes. Okay. So we just finished talking about the peripheral nervous system. We talked about sensory motor and somatic-ish. Now we're talking about autonomic, and that's going to break us down into sympathetic and parasympathetic. General trends that you'll see here is anything sympathetic is going to be speeding up. Anything parasympathetic is going to be slowing down. Parasympathetic, you could be totally relaxed, and sympathetic can trump you at any time. So if you're like sleeping and something scares you, you immediately stop everything parasympathetic and go sympathetic. So parasympathetic can be stopped all the time. Sympathetic cannot. You can't be super scared and somebody be like, it's going to be all right, and then you'd be like, okay, cool. Like, it takes you a long time to come down off that scare. Okay? Okay, good. No, it's not like that at all. So, when we talk about the autonomic nervous system, it mentions that whether, this is comparing somatic versus autonomic, but there's both of them have motor fibers, but the difference is in what they effect. We're also going to hear a lot of ganglial references, where those groups of cell bodies are coming into play. We're also going to reference the neurotransmitters. Good thing about the neurotransmitters is this isn't a course where we have to memorize all the neurotransmitters. We're just basically going to say they're excitatory or inhibitory. Okay? The somatic nervous system specifically, autonomic nervous system specifically innervates cardiac, smooth muscle, and then glands. Any glandular tissue. Okay, so smooth muscle you probably already knew. Cardiac muscle, that makes sense. But glandular tissue, like your adrenal gland. Okay, your pancreas, those are all glands. This diagram is actually very helpful if you know how to read it. Okay, first of all, this chapter is just your autonomic nervous system. So here was somatic nervous, where we had our multipolar neuron, and we had acetylcholine, and it was excitatory. Okay, so that we've already covered all of that. Here we are autonomic. Autonomic is broken up into parasympathetic, which is slowing down, sympathetic, which is speeding up. What this is depicting, do you remember presynaptic and postsynaptic? In a sympathetically innervated organ, the preganglionic, so here's the ganglia, the preganglionic neuron is short, the postganglionic is long. In parasympathetic, to slow you down, the preganglionic is long, the postganglionic is short. And it's truly depicting that here, but if you didn't know what you were looking at, it's not specifically labeling it and telling us that. Okay? It's also showing you that sympathetic neurons are going to release acetylcholine at their spot, their synaptic spot. I don't know why I can't think of that right now. Whatever that is. Okay? And then it's also showing you here that parasympathetic also releases acetylcholine. Now, they're postganglionic fibers, acetylcholine here, but norepinephrine here. So anything speeding up is going to be epinephrine, norepinephrine. So you're going to see E and NE. Those are both excitatory neurotransmitters. So epinephrine, norepinephrine, you might hear it called adrenaline, noradrenaline. Not in these notes, but you may hear that. Okay? So preganglionic is all releasing acetylcholine. Postganglionic in sympathetic is an epinephrine, and in parasympathetic it's acetylcholine. Here it's telling you that the response, whether it's excitatory or inhibitory, really depends on what it is that it's innervating and controlling. So, autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic versus sympathetic. Sympathetic, short preganglionic, long preganglionic. Long postganglionic, short postganglionic. Okay? Acetylcholine, always at the end of the preganglionic fibers, and norepinephrine if we're talking about sympathetic, and acetylcholine if we're talking about parasympathetic. There is some overlap, but on somatic and the autonomic. nervous system. But like I already mentioned, if you're parasympathetically rolling right now, just relax, resting, digesting, being excited because you're not studying. If something excites you, you'll immediately go into sympathetic activation. Okay? Regardless, you need both sympathetic and parasympathetic, and we call that being dually innervated. For example, your heart is dually innervated. So that means it has a sympathetic neuron touching it and a parasympathetic neuron touching it. So whenever I'm working out or I get scared, sympathetic is going. Whenever I'm just watching TV, I really don't watch TV because I just go to sleep, then it's parasympathetic. Okay? So it's dually innervated. If I'm asleep and something scares me, it automatically goes sympathetic. So most of our organs are dually innervated. There are some that are only sympathetically innervated, but still. There should be a dynamic antagonism so that they go back and forth between being excited and not excited. Excited and not excited. Okay? But here we talk about the parasympathetic. Parasympathetic is referred to as rest and repose or rest and digest. One of my students said, and it kind of rhymes, so I get that. During times of parasympathetic dominance, it gives you an example as somebody relaxing and reading after a meal. Their blood pressure, heart rate, and respiratory rates are low. Gastrointestinal activity is high. So acetylcholine is high, getting all those muscles to contract. Their pupils are constricted because they're reading while we're reading right now. Their pupils are constricted, and their lenses are accommodated for close vision. And that's going to be something we talk about in AMP2, the lenses. So for parasympathetic, it directs digestion. Diuresis, what's diuresis? What's defecation? Pooping, and diuresis is peeing, getting rid of liquid waste. Okay? So during parasympathetic dominance, we're digesting, we're moving things around, we're not breathing like a rapid rate, our heart rate should be lower, we should be relaxed. Parasympathetic. Versus sympathetic, which is your fight or flight. And your book references that, and most people have heard of fight or flight before. This really is dominant during exercise, anytime you're excited, in an emergency situation, or you're embarrassed. Characteristics include an increased heart rate, dry mouth, cold, sweaty skin, dilated pupils. Dilated, and we'll talk about this in O2 again, but they're bigger because you're trying to receive more information. Because you're either excited, scared, or whatever, but you're trying to receive more environmental cues about what's going on at that time. Okay, and these are all textbook, so it's possible that people could have other reactions to it. Sympathetic activation during vigorous physical activity. So you're working out, you're mowing the lawn, you're doing something. Blood is shunt from your skeletal muscles, and it goes to your core, your vital organs, your lungs, and your heart. Your bronchioles dilate. What does dilate mean? Get bigger. Bronchioles get air to your lungs. So during sympathetic activation, when you're scared, your bronchioles dilate so you can increase the amount of oxygen you're bringing in, which increases the oxygen that's sent to your tissues. Okay? And it also causes your liver to release glucose. So your stores of glucose, which we spoke about back, I think it was in chapter 2 or 3, it's called glycogen. It says, hey, they need more energy right now. They're scared. Here's the problem, is that this is supposed to be like a stress response, where it takes place over 30 minutes or so, and then you go back to resting. But many of you keep yourself in stressful situations, like you study, you don't, and you're working, and you're trying to raise you're doing all of this. So you're sympathetically dominant a lot of the time. Whenever it is time for you to kind of relax, you don't have enough energy to keep yourself awake, so you immediately shut down and go to sleep. But you're easily aroused, true or false? Usually a lot of you go to bed thinking about what you have to do, and we talked about that. You're like, oh, I gotta do this, I gotta study for this, oh my gosh, I'm gonna fail this. I read your emails. Okay? When we talk about innervation, so dually innervated means it's parasympathetic and sympathetically innervated, but not from the same spot. Parasympathetic activation, or innervation, is either done from the sacral area or the cervical area. So here you have all of these structures that are parasympathetically innervated from either the cervical or the sacral region. Sympathetic innervation takes place between the thoracic and the lumbar area. So the liver and gallbladder are sympathetically innervated as well as parasympathetically innervated. So it's dually innervated. It's just telling you whether it's speeding up or it's slowing down. Okay, so you can see dual innervation, and we're going to talk about a couple of examples. But look at here. One that's on this side that's not on this side. Skin. Sympathetically activated, but can your skin really relax? It doesn't. It has to, if it did relax, I wonder if that would decrease wrinkles. I don't know, but that would be a thought process. When we talk about the parasympathetic division, I mentioned that it originates either in the cervical area, lower cranial area, and the sacral area. That's what this is talking about here. So the cell bodies are in the brainstem. Because it's parasympathetic, the preganglionic fibers are longer, and the postganglionic fibers are shorter. Sorry, I just switched it. Sorry, didn't mean to. Okay, it talks about the different nerves that are served by that area as well, and we've discussed those in the previous chapter. And this continues talking about those, and then this is going to the sacral region. Ultimately, all the parasympathetic innervation is to help you slow down. Okay, help you to reset, to get rid of waste, to digest your food. Okay, so these two slides are talking about that innervation. Here's showing you just parasympathetic and specific innervation patterns. So the sacral area specifically innervates, and then here you have the cervical. Well, that's technically the bottom of the brainstem. It's innervating all of these as well. Okay, so specific innervation patterns. Again, long preganglionic, short postganglionic. So the preganglionic is shown here in that deeper purple, and the lavender color is the postganglionic. So much shorter there for parasympathetic. Questions on that? Okay, then sympathetic is just coming from the area of the thoracolumbar. So that's your thorax to your lumbar areas. Okay, of course we're using rami. Do you remember what rami are? The short ones. We're going to see some ganglia here. Whenever I pointed out on that cross section of the spinal cord, and it had the vertebrae on it as well, I said, here's what we're going to end up calling our sympathetic trunk. And it was a little bit more anterior. Here it is. And what happens is the preganglionic fibers are shorter. They come here, and then they relay into the postganglionic fibers. So here we have a few where it stretches out, but then here you have them going straight to postganglionic. So your preganglionic fibers are shorter, your postganglionic fibers are longer in comparison to the parasympathetic innervation. Parasympathetic innervation would be here and up there. Sympathetic is here in the core. Same organs, of course, except for the skin innervated. Preganglionic, postganglionic, I said that, and the sympathetic trunk. There is no parasympathetic trunk. Okay, just sympathetic only. And that's a relay station. On the pathways, we're going to have an idea for these, but you don't really need to study these in detail because a lot of them you can kind of figure out. But here shows you, okay, here you have your sympathetic trunk, all those ganglia here. You can see your spinal cord there. When we talk about the rami communicating, we're talking about them innervating sweat glands, muscles, or smooth muscle. So, whenever we're talking about sympathetic activation, and it's talking about using the trunk, so I know that this is sympathetic. If it's a rector pili muscle, and it's sympathetic, what am I going to do? A rector pili. I'm going to get goosebumps. If I'm a sweat gland, and it's sympathetic activation, what am I going to do? Release sweat. Okay, so ultimately, a lot of this information is going to be delivered that way, but that's what's going to happen. Vascular smooth muscle. Where's the smooth muscle? In your blood vessels. Okay, vascular smooth muscles, so in your blood vessels, everywhere you have blood vessels. In sympathetic activation, there's two things that could happen. Some of them are going to contract in order to increase your heart rate, and a lot of them will relax in order to increase the blood flow. So it depends on where they are and what they're controlling, but you don't have to know the differences for everyone. Pathways to the head. So all of this is talking about what it would control sympathetically if you were activated, sympathetic activation of the head. So it would, the upper eyelid, salivary glands, all your eye muscles, iris, all of that, it would dilate. So it talks about that there. All of this is sympathetic. When we talk about the fibers innervating the heart, the thyroid, and the lungs, what's the lungs going to do in a sympathetic situation? What are the bronchioles going to do? Dilate. So the lungs are going to increase and allow for more oxygen to be brought in. When it mentions here the esophagus, sympathetic activation, what's the esophagus going to do? It's going to kind of constrict a little bit. Why do I don't need to worry about the esophagus? Sympathetically. It's part of your digestive system. So if you're scared, it's really unlikely that you're going to eat. In fact, we see people, I'm not talking about chronic stress, but when people are really stressed, like scared, or they're dealing with a traumatic time, we see that they really stop eating because they're so sympathetically dominant that they don't have the urge to eat. They're not allowing themselves to relax. So their entire digestive system slows down. Their stomach even shrinks. The longer you go without eating, it'll start to shrink and it'll accommodate less food. So that's why that's mentioned here.
Choking at funerals.
Choking at funerals.
Yeah, like afterwards, whenever everybody goes to eat.
And then they're, well, especially the family, like the people,
Yeah,
yeah,
families will come.
And when you go through a stressful time, it is not uncommon for you to stop eating it. And I can think of multiple people who I've seen go through really stressful times and they will lose weight. Not because they're dieting or eating healthy, but because they're not eating at all. Okay? Still talking about sympathetic activation, but now to the abdomen. Whenever you're sympathetically activated, all of your viscera, abdominal viscera, like your intestines, so small intestines, large intestines, liver, those all kind of, the liver actually works more, but because it's releasing glucagon, but it doesn't do any digestive function as far as producing bile or storing bile in the gallbladder. All of that stops under sympathetic activation. Good example. If you ever do like early morning workouts, or if you're going to work out in the afternoon and you haven't eaten for a few hours, one time you may have eaten before you worked out. But what happened as soon as you started working out? You got sick. Even you hear people, and I know this has happened to me, like I drank water or I drank milk, and I could hear it sloshing in my stomach as I was running. Like you can hear it and kind of feel it, and you're doing like crunches and you can feel that liquid moving because it sits there. As soon as you go from eating to working out, all of that shuts down. So where everything is, it stays there. So if it bothered you to eat, it's because that food was sloshing on your stomach and it hit your esophageal sphincter and it caused you to throw up, or that's a lot of times what will happen. So now you know the next time that you don't eat. But then we have problems with people fainting with early morning workouts because they won't eat because it'll make them throw up. So they'll burn all of their energy and then they're hypoglycemic and they faint. So you see both issues there. But that's one of the main things that people complain about before eating before working out. Pathways to the pelvis. This is a really good example and it's going to talk about here. But first of all, whenever you're sympathetically activated, you normally don't pee or poop. Now, let me say this. I cannot explain the phenomena of when you pee before you play hide and seek, when you get a good hiding spot, why all of a sudden you have to pee. I feel like I don't care how many times I play hide and seek, and we play hide and seek in the dark at our house because I have big kids. And as soon as I get into the good position, I have to pee. So I'm like army crawling to the restroom. I don't know why, and I can't explain that. So, but I do know that a lot of times when people are scared, that it causes them to want to poop if they're emotionally upset. And that's because whenever you get upset, all of those lines that would kind of slow everything down, it causes your stomach to contract and push, and then you feel that need to poop. So, but it's not the same thing because pee and poop don't come from the same hole or the same system at all. So I don't know the whole hide and seek thing. And if you've never had to pee, that's cool. But I always have to pee. Now, what this is about to get into is the innervation of, so here's talking about your bladder, but your reproductive organs, specifically your external genitalia. It's going to talk about, the adrenal cortex. I want to get to that while we're talking about it. Oh, it's not yet. It'll come up here in a second, but I'm going to leave it here because I'll come back to this. But when we're talking about the pelvic innervation, sympathetic and parasympathetic, it's going to talk about how these two work together really well. And it's going to talk about sexual arousal versus orgasm. And this is a perfect example of how these two systems work together. In order for you to be sexually aroused, that's parasympathetic activation. So that's relaxing. But in order for you to actually achieve an orgasm, that's sympathetic. So you have two systems that are battling back and forth, which is a clear explanation why some people have a heart attack as they get older and their health is failing, because their systems are overwhelmed. And I know, like, it sounds like, oh my gosh, I can't believe she's talking, but that's a 100% a true thing. In all situations, able to have an erection, maintain an erection, or to be aroused sexually is parasympathetic. But in order to achieve orgasm, that's sympathetic. So you have to have both systems going. And that's also explaining why men can't have multiple ejaculations real close together. And that goes back to the evolutionary times, because their thing was, I need to have sex, but then now I have to go protect. So they aren't easily aroused again. Versus a female who didn't have to worry about protecting, so they could stay parasympathetic for an extended period of time. And we've seen that pass on evolutionarily. So that's a great explanation of how these two systems come together and work. So sympathetic and parasympathetic. It is covered in a future slide. I just thought it was on this next slide. Here it's talking about the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, what is renal? Kidneys. So adrenal is on top of the kidneys. You have two glands called your adrenal glands that sit on top of your kidneys. There's two parts to the adrenal cortex, and guess where that is? The outside. The cortex is always the outside, and then the adrenal medulla, which would be the middle. The adrenal glands are responsible for releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine. So whenever they talk about adrenaline, that's why they call it adrenaline. It's epinephrine and norepinephrine, technically, that are released from the adrenal gland. And of course, that is under sympathetic activation. The visceral reflex arc is the exact same thing that we looked at earlier, except for, because this is sympathetic, we have our sympathetic trunk here. Okay, if this trunk thing is here, it's sympathetic. Not that you're going to see a diagram like that, but perhaps in your lab. Okay, so I have sensory, and then I have long not presympathetic. I have short preganglionic, long postganglionic here. And here is showing you my sympathetic trunk. So it's our reflex arc, the same as it was, it's just now it's sympathetically innervated. So that's excitatory. The two type of receptors are based on the types of neurotransmitters. So excitatory is what we're talking about. We have cholinergic fibers and adrenergic fibers. Cholinergic fibers are going to release acetylcholine. So we talked about that being released from both sympathetic and parasympathetic preganglionic neurons. And then we talked about epinephrine being released from sympathetic postganglionic neurons. And that's where we talk about adrenergic fibers here, using norepinephrine instead. So this is putting words to that diagram that may be right here. Perfect. Good. So these words here explain the neurotransmitters that are released here. So acetylcholine by both preganglionic, norepinephrine by sympathetic postganglionic, and acetylcholine by parasympathetic postganglionic. So I'm going to go back here real quick because we're going to come back to these words. Cholinergic and adrenergic fibers. Cholinergic are going to be acetylcholine, adrenergic are going to be norepinephrine. So when we look at cholinergic receptors, we have two types, nicotinic and muscarinic, which will help us explain addiction to these two things here. Nicotine, I feel like that's obvious, but muscarinic is what you get from using mushrooms, or the illegal version of them, not mushrooms like that you would get at the grocery store. Okay, just making sure that we're on the same page. Your body does this, and it's going to talk about these in just a moment. But if you take in more nicotine than your body needs, your body stops producing the neurotransmitters that would go into those receptors because you're replacing them. Okay, and it's not going to show you a diagram of this. So you normally have nicotine receptors. They're not actually nicotine receptors, but they receive neurotransmitters that respond to those receptors. They're called nicotinic receptors. When you take in nicotine, we no longer create that neurotransmitter that would naturally go there because we're replacing it synthetically. After you do that a couple times. It doesn't do it like the first time or the second time, but after you develop a pattern, this is what leads to the habituation of that. Because you're providing it synthetically, your body no longer creates it naturally. So then when you don't provide it synthetically, your body's in a need for it. So then you need that fix to calm those receptors. We see this happening in people who use steroids. That's why they go on those rages, because when you put more testosterone in someone, their body stops producing testosterone. And because you continue to add it synthetically, the testes actually shrink because they don't have to work anymore. Then when you stop taking the steroids, the testosterone isn't there anymore, and you have this raging individual who can't control their emotions because they were using a synthetic form of something that they make naturally. So that's why that withdrawal process is such a long and drawn-out process, because you have to teach your body to make that back again. And sometimes you just can't do it. Okay? So this is telling you that the nicotinic receptors, they have a stimulatory effect. So they naturally respond to acetylcholine, but if you take in nicotine, that nicotine will replace that acetylcholine. So we'll no longer use the acetylcholine there. Okay, muscarinic receptors, exact same thing, but here we have it with the recreational/illegal form of shrooms. So you naturally create those neurotransmitters, but when you use these illicit drugs, they replace them, and then you stop making them. Okay, on the alpha and beta types of receptors, this is adrenergic, so these are using epinephrine. So it's talking about epinephrine there. These are specifically going straight into drugs, like atropine. Atropine is a drug that we use to block any type of acetylcholine release, which keeps us from salivating and drooling during like oral surgery and stuff. So if they're doing like a long-term, we don't want you to start salivating. We want to keep all of that dry. Another example is neostigmine, which will inhibit inhibits acetylcholinesterase. Acetylcholinesterase breaks down acetylcholine. People with myasthenia gravis, their face kind of droops, and that's because the muscles won't contract. Well, if there's a whole lot of acetylcholinesterase, it's breaking down the acetylcholine. Well, we need to inhibit the breakdown of that acetylcholine because we need these muscles to do what? Contract. So that all of these drugs that they talk about have to either excite or inhibit. You're going to see that same pattern. It's just how does it go about exciting or how does it go about inhibiting? So in this case, we're inhibiting. Over-the-counter drugs are alpha blockers, or alpha adrenogenic, not blockers. Beta blockers is what I just saw there. And those specifically, it's talking about for colds, allergies, nasal congestion. Those are all basic. Beta blockers are things that you usually have to have a prescription to get. Like you don't just go get an inhaler with a general type of medication in it. Like you have to be prescribed that. I already talked about the dual innervation of most of your organs. So sympathetic division, increased heart rate, respiratory rate, inhibits digestion and elimination. Parasympathetic decreases heart rate, respiratory rate, and allows for digestion and discarding of wastes. So that's been reiterated there. Here, this chart gives every organ or system, and it continues on in a couple slides, tells you whether it's parasympathetically impacted, sympathetically impacted, both, none, whatever. So it gives you all that information here. Sympathetic tone. This can change. So the more stressed you are, you tend to be more jumpy and like you bounce your knee and stuff like that. Sympathetic tone is how you are sympathetic, and you should be slightly sympathetically dominant most of the time in your life. But some of you are really laid back, and I use the fact that you're laid back to say that you're more parasympathetically dominant, but you shouldn't be that way the whole time. It's just a term I use to help you make that connection. So you should have some type of sympathetic tone where your heart rate continues at a certain rate, regardless of whether you're sleeping or you're exercising. We want it to increase. We don't want it to go below a certain rate because that'd be consistent with death. We don't want that. All right, so there's some type of tone. So that's what this is referencing here. You can change that, whether you're at rest, whether you're working out. The more you work out and you work your sympathetic system, the more at rest, like your heart rate becomes lower, your respiratory rate becomes lower, the more endurance that you have built up. This is continuing on that sympathetic tone. Whenever we talk about people being stressed for a really long time, like the bouncing of the knees and stuff like that, we see some of their vessels dilate to increase blood flow, but a lot of them constrict, which is what leads to headaches and all of that. Long-term stress like that, or long-term poor diet choices, can lead to buildup in your vessels, like cholesterol buildup, which actually constrict them, not naturally, but because of their exposure to environmental aspects. We have, it leads to high blood pressure, hypertension. So what do we do when you have high blood pressure? If you go to the doctor and say, I have high blood pressure, the doctor will tell you what? Yeah, stop stressing will be the first thing. You probably need to lose weight, you need to work out, and then they'll probably give you a blood pressure pill. When they give you a blood pressure pill, all of your ails go away, so you don't change your lifestyle, you do what you're going to do, and then your stress levels continue to increase. You usually gain weight, and then you have to have more blood pressure medicine prescribed to you so that you can maintain homeostasis. So again, it depends on what type of medicine that you want to go into, and as a nurse or a physician's assistant, whatever you do, my idea would be that you would tell them how to deal with it naturally, and then help them gain that, because our entire society right now is definitely dependent upon medications. Parasympathetic tone is how you are when you're parasympathetically dominant, when you're just relaxing. It talks about, your heart rate's lower, your respiratory rate is lower, but it mentions the very last that it can be overridden immediately by a sympathetic activation. So if something scares you, all of this is completely overridden. So you go from digesting food to all of a sudden you're up and going. Cooperative effects. Here's where it's talking about the two systems working together. And this is talking about the reference to maintaining an erection or being aroused sexually. So that's all parasympathetic. And then sympathetic is the actual achievement of an orgasm. So both of these systems have to coordinate together in order for that for those events to take place. So again, we do see a lot of patients, especially geriatric patients, that it gets them. The heart gets it. Unique roles of the sympathetic division. Sympathetic division responds to heat. It causes you to stress, so you sweat. If you're working out, then you're not necessarily sweating because you're stressed. You're sweating because you're trying to maintain homeostasis. So thermoregulators, release of renin from the kidneys. So we're trying to maintain our water balance. Metabolic effects, increases metabolic rate of cells, high blood pressure or high glucose levels, and mobilizes fats for fuel. So you'll use your sugar first, and when your sugar runs out, then you'll use fat. This should be a short-term response. And I keep saying that, but this is what leads to our society being very unhealthy, is because they're under chronic stress. So we see that their body temperatures don't have a basic homeostatic level, that their kidneys either are overactive or underactive, depending on their diet and how much water they take in. Initially, it increases the metabolic rate of your cells, but the longer you stress your cells, the slower they become. Raises your blood glucose levels initially, but then you don't want to eat anymore, so your blood glucose levels drop, and then when you do eat, you overeat. You can see where this pattern is going. Okay, sympathetic division versus parasympathetic division. Sympathetic division lasts a lot longer because you'll release epinephrine into your bloodstream, and everywhere that blood travels will be impacted by epinephrine. When it's parasympathetic, that's very local. So that's short-term, a short duration, and we can end it pretty quickly as well. And I gave that example at the very beginning. When you're, eating or you're sleeping and somebody scares you, you jump up really quick. and you immediately go into sympathetic overdrive. You don't go from being really upset to, hey, I'm cool, very fast. It takes a really long time to get back that way. So you're more likely to be trumped sympathetically than parasympathetically, which is, you don't usually get trumped parasympathetically. Controls overall, what is the main part of your body that controls the autonomic nervous system? It's your hypothalamus. We referenced that when we talked about the central nervous system the last time we were together. So the hypothalamus is right above the pituitary gland, and the hypothalamus controls thirst, hunger, temperature, all of that. So it makes sense that any sympathetic or parasympathetic impacts will have something to do with hunger, thirst, temperature, all of that would make sense. And it continues to tell you here, we're doing body temperature, water balance, heart activity, blood pressure. How does water balance, real quick, impact blood pressure? Because that's going to come up later. Water balance and blood pressure. What if you are dehydrated? What does that do to your blood pressure? Why is it lower?
Less fluid in the tank.
There's less fluid. And initially, at first, it could increase your heart rate. But then, because the viscosity of your blood, your heart is trying to work harder, but then it's not pumping. And whenever you have a whole lot of water, like you're adequately hydrated, your blood pressure should be pretty low. If you're overhydrated, then you're causing it to work too much. But you should be, if you're overhydrated and peeing, you should be fine. Okay, but we want to see water balance, so we have a good homeostatic blood pressure. We want to see a lot of water there. We would rather see more water than less water. So initially, your body's going to work harder when your blood is thicker. But if it stays that way and you're dehydrated, your kidneys are going to give out, so you're on your way out. Anyway, emotional stages, we go from being happy to being sad, being hungry to being thirsty. Your sexual drive, these are all controlled. And fight or flight, we've discussed that already. This is your hypothalamus again, taking care of everything. When you talk about rage, fear, pleasure, all of that, that also incorporates your limbic system, and I told you that was your emotional setup. So we discussed that the last time we were together as well. Cortical controls. Do you remember what cortical was? We talked about this last time. What was our main focus on the central nervous system? Cortical. Cortex. So when it's saying cortical controls, it's referring to the cortex of the brain, which is the outer few millimeters, which happens to be gray matter. Very good. It's telling you here that you roll off of biofeedback. So biofeedback is feedback that you get as you are, what's bio mean? Alive. Good. Good. So it gives you the example here of being able to receive information like you're about to get a headache or you're about to get a migraine. How can you control your surroundings, your environment in order to prevent that? That does take a lot of coaching and being able to calm yourself down enough to where the stress levels get to a point where you don't experience a migraine. That, like I said, that takes a long time. And if you can do that, your cortex can override all of that. But it takes a lot of training to get yourself into that role. So it's referencing the fact that your cortex can control or help control situations, parasympathetic and sympathetically. Here it's talking about two disorders associated with the autonomic nervous system, hypertension, which is high blood pressure. Our goal there would be to get you back to a primary state where your blood pressure was lower, so whether it's diet, exercise, like whatever it is. And if you are living a healthy lifestyle and you just have high blood pressure, which is a thing, then we're going to put you on a medication to help decrease that, to take the stress off of your heart. Raynaud's disease means that you have exaggerated vasoconstriction in your distal appendages. What's vasoconstriction? The blood vessels shrink up. People with Raynaud's disease have like a bluish, greenish fingertips because there's not a lot of oxygen there. And their hands tend to be colder because there's no oxygen there. Painful sometimes. Autonomic dysreflexia. Autonomic dysreflexia is usually what we see take place with people who are quadrupeds. So they're quadriplegic, so completely paralyzed, but they're sympathetically activated, but they can't do anything. So their heart goes out of control, and that can be lethal. That can lead to their death. So autonomic dysreflexia because their heart goes out of control, their blood pressure skyrockets, and there's no way for them to react to that because they can't move. Developmental aspects of the autonomic nervous system. So this is our, because it's autonomic, we have no control over this at all. So we see that our autonomic nervous system pretty much takes its role from development all the way throughout life. You should have no problem with your autonomic nervous system unless you're damaged at some point as a young person. As you get older, we see our system start to slow down. So you see that pattern mentioned here as well. What do we see on geriatric patients? Their autonomic nervous system, we see more constipation, dry eyes, thinner skin, eye infections, orthostatic hypotension. What's that? What's hypotension? Low blood pressure. Orthostatic. They have been in the same position for a really long time, and then they get up, and their blood pressure is really low. So it's usually because they're not moving a lot, so orthostatic. Okay, not moving a lot. Static telling us that they're not moving. Low blood pressure after position change, and it's mentioning all that there. All right, guys. That's it for 01. I know, right? I feel like